Robert's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the author of 27 books, but again, this is his first novel after all those more academic books. The Quality of Life's set between London and Amsterdam, and we'll be hearing a lot about that this evening. And copies are available from Woodstock Bookshop. They've got copies in now, and from other bookshops as well. You can order it online and click and collect from places like Jaffa and Neil, as you can your book. Yeah, Juliet. So that's how to get copies of the book. So Juliet, over to you.
Thank you. Well, Robert and I haven't met each other very much, except on 2 occasions. Once when I delivered my book to your house.
Yes.
But my first question, and what I'm very interested in, is I have read that you are a meticulous scholar critic.
Yes.
And I'd like to know what prompted this transition from a meticulous scholar critic to the author of a novel?
I suppose a good one-word answer would be frustration.
Oh, that's interesting.
If you're a scholar, you're rather hemmed in by facts. You have to be accurate. You have to be true. Even if you're a biographer, you have to be true to the facts, and we've both written biographies. So there are limitations to the role. I just think it's such a relief to be able to write something which is purely imagined.
And it's all about the imagination, isn't it?
Yes.
And even though there are facts involved, like with your paintings, and the conditions under which they were written, and also where they are precisely, the imagination takes over, and you can put your facts in with the imagination taking the leading role.
I think so. I mean, I allowed myself a bit more leeway than you, because you've written a historical novel set in the early 19th century, and several of the people are actually real, like Charlotte Bronte. So we know what happens to her.
Yes.
So you can't give her children because she didn't have any.
No,
you know?
Exactly.
You can't make Emily short because she was tall.
Yes.
So there are certain limitations. You have to check the facts with mine, while the paintings are actually there, and most of them are hanging in the National Gallery. The people are all imagined, and they have a life of their own.
Uh-huh. So art is a critical component of the book. So much of it is about art.
Yeah.
And your protagonist is an artist.
Right.
When did you first become interested in art?
Well, I've always been interested in art. I used to haunt art galleries when I was very young. I had a period in my adolescence when I tried to be an oil painter. It wasn't terribly successful, but I remember how enjoyable it was and how absorbing it was. It's the only activity where I seem totally to lose sense of time. You know, on a Saturday afternoon, I'd stand in front of my canvas with my oil paints, and suddenly it was dinner time. And I think that must be one of the main attractions of art and being an artist. I later on became very interested in interpreting art verbally. What I did was write a series of poems around particular paintings. I wrote a poem about a picture by Pizarro called Foxhill in the Snow, which is in the National Gallery. When they found out about this, they got me into the National Gallery to read my poem in front of the painting. Mm-hmm. And the person who was in charge of that particular program then got a job with Royal Holloway and Bedford New College, where they've got a marvellous gallery full of Victorian paintings. He got in touch with me and said, "You're obviously interested in what we call ekphrastic painting. Would you like to write a poetry sequence around these pictures?" Mm-hmm. So that's what I did. That was the next stage. The next stage was early last year, I was phoned up by the music department at Royal Holloway and said, "These are very nice poems. Could we please set them to music and perform in the gallery in front of the paintings?" So just before lockdown last year, just before the beginning of March, we had 3 lunchtime concerts in the concert hall with the choir singing settings of my poems in front of the relevant pictures.
Lovely. And did they all have the poems in some kind of form to hold them?
They did, yes, and they were all published by the college.
Oh, splendid.
Yeah.
So that's, you've got a long history of an appreciation of art.
Well, I suppose so, yes, but I'm not an art historian, and I quite deliberately take a line which is not art historical. I think probably you're an art historian, you can tell me about this. But I mean, one of the objects of an art historian is to interpret pictures.
Yes, and I found that quite difficult at university when I had red felt pen put through some of my essays saying too subjective.
Yes.
Because I was not being objective as a historian. My experience of art was from childhood, really.
Yes.
We were taken to art galleries and to exhibitions when we were in London staying with our grandparents. My mother took us to lots of exhibitions. So art was something that was very familiar to me, always. And so I wanted to work with some kind of career that would take me back into art galleries and just looking at them. Yeah. But it's a different matter when you're an art historian because of those facts that we've already talked about.
That's right.
You have to stick to facts and you can't fantasize about them.
One thing which slightly annoyed me when I used to haunt art galleries is I go into a particular room and then maybe there were 5 or 6 people in front of the picture, all interpreting it very subjectively, as you say. Then suddenly a gaggle of school children would arrive with their teacher, and the teacher would stand between the canvas and the kids and tell them what the canvas was about. Yes. I could see in those kids' eyes opportunities were opening up, but they were also closing down.
Because they weren't allowed to say it themselves.
They weren't allowed to say it themselves. Yes. And their purely subjective interpretations somehow vanished as wrong.
Oh, how awful. I once created a competition for children at the Ashmolean.
Yeah.
And I went on to Radio Oxford and I could see that they sent somebody along to keep me down in case I wasn't going to say the right things.
Right.
Anyway, I organised this competition, and one of the things I asked them to do was to just copy on a piece of paper The Return of the Dove to the Ark by Milan.
Right.
And funny enough, it was my youngest nephew who put a great balloon in the mouth of the girl saying, "Hello, here's the dove."
Yeah.
And that was just great. So children can look at art in a very interesting way, and they can reveal things that perhaps we might not have seen.
What I tried to do in this novel is to bring the paintings to life. Mm-hmm. There are 5 paintings. They've all got a life of their own. Well, and what I tried to do is to sort of unfreeze the paintings. The paintings are static. I've allowed them to be unfreezed and actually to exploit the dramatic potential of each painting. And to demonstrate that, can we perhaps turn to slide 3, Paddy? I just read you from the very beginning of the book. This is a painting called A Scene from Terence by Nikolai Abildgaard, with an 18th century Danish artist. It's quite a busy painting because it actually shows a scene from a play by Terence. There's quite a lot of activity going on, but it's very, very static. And I've tried to unfreeze it in what I've done. So I've begun right inside the picture, describing what's inside the picture. And then I've described somebody looking at the picture while somebody looks at them. So there's a kind of recession going on. "Run now," yelled the maid. "In God's name, run." Once out in the cobbled street, the midwife picked up her skirts and ran, the maid staring from the open window. So little time. Towards her in the archway at the head of the street, a farm cart clattered. On the roof of the adjacent temple, its ochre walls cut by the late afternoon shade, an owl kept silent vigil. The cicadas droned. The sodden air combed against her, but the midwife dragged on and on. So very little time. As she approached the temple, she passed 2 strangers sauntering. The younger, his hand cupped to his mouth, leant towards his companion, unctuous, conspiratorial. The mother within, sir, seduced by none other than. The elder's face cracked wide open, gaping like a gargoyle. At their feet, a pariah dog scowled, glowering, mercurial. From the mantel above the still open window, the obscene face of a god leered from its alcove. On the temple roof, the owl had not moved. The hours dripped on leadenly towards sundown. Quatuor quinque. The dog yawned. In the archway between the turning wheels, the plebeian still perched, behind his horse. Still the god's face creaked, and the hunched midwife struggled to her next appointment, the maid from the window endlessly egging her on, up the narrow street, through the cramped arch where the cart still strained, bulging. The strangers continued to grimace. Slowly the light died. Sex, Septem, so little time. In the gateway, the cart still lurched onwards down from the olive-clad hilltops. Still the midwife ran, and the figure before the canvas leaned and gazed. I had been watching them both for several minutes.
That's the very opening of the book. You don't do that with each painting.
No.
You do it with only the first one, and then you introduce the protagonist, don't you?
Yes, that's right.
I was going to ask you about the role of the paintings, but is it that your role is to expose the paintings?
Is to bring them to life. Actually.
To bring them to life.
Yes. I've tried to write the kind of novel in which the action stems from the paintings.
Mm-hmm. Because I was trying to find out what were the similarities between the paintings and what was going to be in the narrative after the painting has been presented. Right. I managed that with the Duchess of Milan.
Yes.
Which is quite obvious.
Yes.
And with Belshazzar's Feast, I had a little bit of a problem, but you certainly seem to know and admire Rembrandt. Yes. In fact, Rembrandt comes in a great deal, and you obviously have a very great love of Dutch art.
Yes.
So am I right in thinking that the paintings do refer to the text?
I think the other way around, really. The text refers to the paintings, but not in a very obvious way.
Not obvious at all. No.
I think it becomes more and more allegorical as time goes on with Belshazzar's Feast. You remember, this is where Belshazzar is suddenly struck by writing on a wall, "Thou hast been weighed in the balance and found wanting." It occurs at a moment in the story where Benedict, the protagonist, has been found wanting, and he wonders whether he's wanting. So there's a kind of moral significance.
So there is obviously a rapport between them, yes.
Yes.
I'm going to come to our most problematic aspect of writing a novel that both of us have attempted, and that is the question of the first-person narrator.
Yes.
It's by definition one side of the story.
Yes.
Given this first person is looking at all the other people through his or her own eyes.
Yes.
Unlike Middlemarch, for example, where you have an entire village done so exquisitely by Georges Sand, who is writing in the third person, and so you get to know everybody in Middlemarch and their interaction with each other.
Yes.
With the first person narration, you have one person's view of the story.
Yes.
It's that person is telling the story.
Right.
Do you think you probably prefer this kind of writing?
I think it's one alternative. The point about having a third person narrator is that they can be omniscient. The illusion is that they see everything. With a first person narrator, by definition, that person does not see everything. He sees it very, very subjectively, or she sees it very, very subjectively. They have the limitations as well as their patches of insight. Now, in Mr. Nichols, your splendid novel about the Bronte, the narrator is a boy who ages between, I think, the age of 12 and 15 during the course of the story. Now, there are certain things the boy does not understand. The reader is older than the boy. So I think that the reader is aware of blind spots in the narrative that the narrator can't see, but the reader can. Similarly with mine, my artist figure is about 31 at the beginning of the story. He ages gradually, and he gradually matures. As he matures, I think he notices more and more. But to begin with, I think there's quite a lot that he doesn't see, but the reader does. So you'll find yourself as the novelist, as it were, signaling over the head of your first-person narrator, saying, "Don't believe what you're being told."
I wanted to ask you, it's set mostly in 1986. Is Ben the younger Robert Fraser?
We have a moment that you have similarities, yes, but there we also have dissimilarities. I'm not a painter. I hope my career has been a bit more purposeful than his. He's a bit of a drifter, isn't he? He doesn't quite know where he's going.
No, he doesn't know where he's going. And he's got a bit of a downer on himself.
A bit of a downer on himself.
Yes. And that's I found that quite difficult for the protagonist to have that attitude towards himself.
Yes.
Because his relationships are a bit woolly, aren't they?
Yes, okay. There are other things, like, for example, there's one moment where at the end of, I think it is the second part, he gets extremely angry. Can you remember that?
Yes.
He has a boiling rage, and he rages around London because he thinks he's been humiliated. Now, anger is an emotion which I don't experience very often, and I don't think I did back then, but I had to somehow create anger on the page, although I don't often feel it myself.
That's just as well. I've got another thing to ask you about Ben and yourself.
Oh yes.
You, as Professor of English Literature, are obviously a lover of words.
Yes.
You use many words that are extremely obscure.
Right.
Or would be unknown to the reader.
Right.
I came across many of them and I underlined them and put a little star next to them. And I thought, shall I look up what it means?
Right.
And I thought, no, I'm not going to. I'm going to see if I can try and understand what it means. But I often wasn't able to. And there's even some Latin in there.
What's wrong with Latin?
Nothing's wrong with Latin.
He's a Catholic. He's a Catholic.
I know he's a Catholic, and that's why I was trying to work out why he should speak in Latin. And I thought, oh yes, he had his Catholic upbringing, and I know that.
He knows Latin.
Is this use of obscure, unusual words something that comes with your flow of writing, as you know them and as you probably love them?
Right. It probably does. I can excuse myself by saying at the beginning of the book, the protagonist is a rather pretentious young man.
Oh,
that's one of his limitations. He does make mistakes. He has got flaws. He's a bit conceited, and his verbal conceit is maybe an aspect of that.
Oh, good. Well, then I can read my little bit. Because I'm wondering, would you want your reader to look up these words that Ben uses?
No. No. I assume my readers are very learned people.
Well, I want to read you a little bit that foxed me.
All right, okay.
Okay, and you're describing here Ben's uncle's appearance, his face and his head.
Right.
Now, as I took my stand beside him, I noticed from furtive sidelong glances that the grey, previously confined to his sideburns, was creeping towards the crown of his head.
Right.
This I might have ignored had it not been for the emaciated appearance of his features, making the nose, in our family, resolutely Roman, stand out unnaturally from the face. The sunken aspect of his body, previously inches taller than my own, now hunched for warmth within the tatterdemalion lineaments of his coat.
Yes.
For the almost phthisical whiteness of the neck against the lurid crimson of his scarf.
Right.
Now that held me up a bit, and that's why I needed to talk to you about it.
Right.
Would Ben use those words? Or is it you using those words?
I think Ben might when he's showing off.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
But
he does tend to show off. He shows off to his girlfriends.
Yes,
He's a bit insecure. So he shows off a lot. And the verbosity is an aspect of his insecurity. Is that all right?
Yes, that's all right. There's also page 227, the word aleatoric.
Yeah. Or if you know about music, aleatoric is chance music. It's chance music. That's right.
And calipigorously.
Oh, well, that's to do with bums.
With which?
With bums.
Bumps?
Bums.
Oh, bums. Oh.
If you've got an elegant bottom, you move in that way. Now, I would have thought that you, as an artist, you'd know about the Venus de Milo.
I do, but
who is very, very famous for her posterior as well as her posture.
I do, but I don't know about that word.
Well, you should, and I'm adding it to your vocabulary.
Okay. A bit I really enjoyed was the bits where you're talking about art, obviously, and I'm going to quote again the experience of the child looking at art.
Right.
The child and an exposure to Rembrandt page 379. Here we are. We reserved the last morning for the Rijksmuseum. On our family visits to Amsterdam, it had always been in the nature of a flying stop. My father had a limited appreciation of painting for its own sake, and my mother had visited the gallery so often on her own compulsory outings from Utrecht that to have lingered over the exhibits would have been for a variety of self-imposed torture. I suppose I must have been there first aged around 6, because the paintings were still a good foot above my head. By the time my eyes drew level with the base of the pictures, my attitude, thanks to Claude, had been transformed. I liked the early Italian triptychs because they reminded me of altarpieces, and I still recall kneeling down on the parquet floor one chill winter morning to inspect an angel's foot. The foot was remarkable enough, but I mainly remember the flannel edges of my pants rubbing against the exposed skin of my thigh. Did the infant Rembrandt have such trouble, I wondered, scuttling around the back streets of Leiden?
Right.
I thought that was marvellous about a child's introduction to art.
Oh, thank you very much.
Research, we mentioned this before we were there. Research, how to combine the truth of what happened in the past with an imaginative view of it.
Right. Now, can we go now maybe to the next slide? This is a Hans Holbein painting of Christina of Denmark, Duchess of Milan. It's well known, it's in the, I think it's a picture we both very much like.
Yes.
There's an awful lot of background that you could cite to illuminate this painting. In fact, it was a commission given by Henry VIII to Holbein. He was thinking of marrying this girl, and he wanted, obviously you couldn't take photographs in the 15th century. So he asked Holbein to do a painting of her and actually send it to him so he could decide whether she was good looking or not. Now that is quite interesting to know all that, but you don't need to know that in order to enjoy the picture. So what I tried to do is to come at the picture from a completely different and perhaps rather surprising angle. So I've introduced actually into my story a young woman indeed called Christina. Now in the passage I'm about to read, Ben has gone to visit Christina in her flat. They knew one another 15 years previously when they were students. He doesn't know whether she will remember him, but he's turned up specifically with the object of doing a portrait of her, painting her, which is what Claude wants him to do. So this is what happens. As I made my way from the underground station, I felt my pulse rising. I took the lift up to the 4th floor and in due course found myself at Christina's doorway, no longer in tortured fantasy, but about to ring the bell. In my left hand, I held the envelope. In my right, I clutched a plastic portfolio. I had left my usual peaked cap at home and could not therefore remove it. I leant forward, pushed the porcelain bell within its brass surround, and coughed. I coughed again. I placed the envelope in my gloved right hand, moved the portfolio to my left, shuffled in my toes, shoes, and paws. I waited some considerable time before next pressing the bell. I was about to ring for a 3rd time when the door slowly edged open. She was evidently herself on the way out. Around her shoulders, she wore a fur-edged cape, generously shaped and reaching almost to the ground. In her tapered, anxious fingers lay a pair of white kid gloves, twisted as if in embarrassment, while on the 4th finger of her left hand, facing outward towards me, was an unpretentious ring bearing a small ruby or garnet. She stood perfectly still, looking at me straight in the eyes. It was a ridiculously tiny lobby, painted the vivid green of corroded copper, and she stood in the corner of it as if guarding a shrine. She was wearing some kind of a cap matching her cloak. A single light source well to her right beyond the rim of the door illuminated her face, while casting an oblique shadow against the containing wall. The mouth was pursed, the nose straight, the eyebrows slightly arched. The eyes appeared apprehensive, but gave absolutely nothing away. All of the carefully prepared words flew out of my head. What was I to say? Should I, in the face of such austerity and defensiveness, construct another story on the spot? There was no need. "You're Arnold's friend," she said archly. "Arnold?" I replied, fumbling. "Yes." "It's not exactly convenient." Her voice had that fruity quality of the well-bred English female, rather like a bass flute. "He said tomorrow." "Well, come in." It was a restrained and orderly room, such as one finds featured in the glossier monthly periodicals. Three walls were painted coffee, while a recess was covered in hessian. Metal blinds concealed a set of French windows, which presumably led onto some kind of patio. In the middle of the room, on a spotless skin rug, stood a glass-topped table supporting a simple fluted vase holding a flame red poinsettia. The only visible picture was a print of St. Mark's Square, Venice, in a plain aluminium frame. Next to the door, there was a plush Chesterfield sofa, behind which a black and white batik print was illuminated by a stainless steel swivel spotlight. In desperation, I inspected the ceiling, hoping for mouldings or cornices on which to comment. "Have you had a lot of experience of this sort of work?" she asked with a terse politeness before I had a chance to speak. We seemed unexpectedly to have come to the point. "Well, I ventured I had been studying the technique for years. Of course, it isn't always easy to capture the essence of what one wants. One usually has to work fairly intensively with the subject over a number of weeks." There was a slack, connected moment before she said, "But surely you only have to stand or sit or something." "Sometimes," I persisted, dully blundering on, "I like to assess the subject from all possible angles. It's a vital preparation for the selection of a pose. Sometimes, remarkably, it's often possible to combine different vantage points from the same perspective. It's rather difficult to explain, but marvelous when it works." "I wanted a model," she protested, "not a strutting doll." "I beg your pardon?" "Didn't Arnold tell you it's for a version of Venus and Adonis? I was wanting someone to stand in for Adonis. Arnold said you had the appropriate doomed and voluptuous air. He also said you had the thighs." "The thighs?" My mind inscribed an arabesque. "I'm sorry if it isn't quite what you were looking for. Perhaps you were expecting to sit in for a profile. If the work doesn't suit you, there's really no problem. Life models are 10 a penny, really." My brain continued to churn on its miserable way. Had I understood her right? Was she expecting to paint me?
Another thing I'd like to talk about is the novel's action is in fact in retrospect,
Yes.
As mine is.
Yes.
But we don't know that at the beginning.
No.
We find that out later.
Yes.
And there are little hints of it through the book.
Yes.
Then we get the full force of what's happening now and what happened to them at the end.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering I think about the beginning of Rebecca. Last night I dreamed I went back to Mandalay. It's utterly gripping from the moment you have begun chapter 1.
Yes.
And I began mine with the older person looking back, and the newspaper article from which I based the whole of my book.
Right.
Dealing in retrospect is difficult, isn't it?
It is. But I decided not to actually begin with the present and go back to the past as you have done, or as Rebecca does. I decided to give the perhaps the false illusion that we're in fact in the present, that we are in fact now in the 1980s, and that the 31-year-old Ben is telling us as it happened. It's only later that it dawns on us, as one draws back from the action, that in fact he's looking at it.
Yes.
30 years later. And this is rather similar to the technique at the beginning, I think, by starting in the picture and then drawing back. It's a sort of panning out, a sort of cinematic effect, I hope.
And but there are a lot of surprises at the very end.
Yes.
About what happened to everybody.
Yes.
Who they ended up with, which come as a big surprise.
Yes.
Because we've had no hint of that for early on, especially these characters who appear. And I was most surprised that Ben ended up with who he did.
Yes.
Anyhow, that's another aspect of writing a book where your imagination is allowing you to do what you want to do with time.
Yes.
I'm looking at our own time, and I see that two of the things that are explored in the book are perfection and truth.
Yes.
Two very different abstract concepts that cannot easily be discussed or portrayed.
Yeah.
But it's there,
Yes.
they're there, and there are discussions about it. And I think about Keats saying beauty is truth and truth is beauty, that is all you need to know on earth, etc. So there are concepts that are explored throughout the book, and they're important for paintings, but they're quite difficult concepts. And I think the fact that you've got people talking about it, those things in terms of paintings, that's a way of doing it, because it is difficult to write about big concepts like that.
Yes, it is.
When I teach history of art, I always say, just remember what the word art means. It's artifice.
Yes.
It's this, and I think about something Andrew Lawson once brought to my attention, and that is that somebody once approached Matisse and said to him, but this is a flower. And he said, no, it's not a flower. It's a painting of a flower.
Yes, that's right.
And I think we have to remember that any kind of discussion of truth, and we haven't talked about portraiture, which we need to, is about the artist's own concept of the writer's own concept of what truth or perfection is.
Right.
But in terms of artifice, he's using the medium of the novel or the canvas to try and explain those things.
Right. I mean, that's where, for example, thinking about Christina, because Ben has known her before 15 years, he knows her a lot better than his uncle does. But his uncle is sort of platonically in love with this girl and wants Ben to paint a portrait of her along the same lines as a Holbein, idealizing her.
Yes.
And Ben tries desperately to idealize her, but that effort is at war with her knowledge of her actual personality, which is quite frolicsome and quite difficult, and at times quite bitchy. And he doesn't know whether to be true to the Christina that he's known, or the Christina that Claude wants him to paint.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I think this also introduces the subject, which I think is quite important to the book, about what is of value in art. Why did I set it in the 1980s?
It's one of my questions.
Yes, I think the 1980s was a decade when commercialism entered into art appreciation in quite a big way. It was when the Turner Prize started, big value started, being attached to certain paintings. And certain people, particularly journalists, talk about the commercial value of a work of art as if it was synonymous with its artistic value. And as far as I'm concerned, commercial value and artistic value are two very different things. And what I've actually got, that there are two characters whom we haven't mentioned in the book. The one is a rather trendy artist who does it very well and ends up as an RA and ends lots of prizes. The other one is a rather conservative art historian who resists all these blandishments and is not really taken in by this. Ironically, of course, the art historian ends up writing the biography of the artist.
Yes,
but I think that one of the main sources of conflict towards the end of the book is the two very different criteria of artistic excellence, the commercial and the aesthetic.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I come across that people say, well, when you look at my painting, tell me what it's worth. I said, no idea.
Yes.
No idea. I can tell you, for some reason, I can tell you if it's good or not.
Yes.
But I can't tell you its value.
Everybody turns on Fiona Bruce to find out whether it's a fraud or not.
I can always tell.
If it's a fraud, you know, it sort of decreases in value 100-fold.
And even though you love it. There's something I want to say about portraiture. There's a recent article written by somebody at the Courtauld who said that in a portrait there are two aspects, there are two people. There's the model or the sitter who is passive, and there's the artist who is active.
Right. Is this true?
I'm wondering, that's what I want to ask you, and I'm wondering if there's a third person involved.
Who's the third person?
The person looking at the portrait.
Yes, exactly.
So there's the model.
Yes.
There's the painter.
Yes.
And there's the person looking at the portrait.
I strongly believe that beauty lies in the eye of the beholder.
The eye of the beholder.
The meaning of a work of art is actually in the mind of the person who looks at it.
Yes. That's why somebody who loves a painting that they have in their bedroom, that we would really object to having, you know, within a mile of our house, it doesn't matter.
There's no such thing as good taste and bad taste. It's just taste, isn't there?
Yes.
I think so.
I've really got one final question, because you answered one of them when I asked you if you painted.
Yes.
But associated with that is, which of the paintings you used in the book would you like to inhabit?
Well, that's very interesting. I've got the Avenue Middle harness on my wall.
Oh, you have?
I think it's the only one I've got on the wall. One of the paintings I would quite like to inhabit is the painting which is not described in the book, but which is on the cover, which is it's a painting by a man called Elinga, Pietro Gentenza Elinga, with whom the narrator is very, very impressed. I'd love to inhabit that room.
You would?
I'd love to be inside that room.
And I also want to ask you, which is really my final question, unless we have other things that other people want to ask us, is going back to your profession as a professor of English literature, what work of literature would you take to a desert island?
And I'm not allowed the Bible or Shakespeare. It has to be Marcel Proust.
Oh, does it have to be Proust?
It has to be.
In French or in English?
In French.
Really?
I've written a book about Proust.
I know you have.
Proust is my favourite novelist.
Is he?
By far.
Really? And despite the length of La Recherche, that would entertain you while you're there? It would take you through?
Well, it takes about 6 months properly to read it from cover to cover.
Really? Someone might have saved you by then.
Yeah, oh dear. Well, I'd send them away.
Oh, really? You take Proust? That's interesting. I would take Jane Eyre. It was a toss-up between Middlemarch.
That would only last you a couple of weeks.
No, because I could never tire of Charlotte Bronte's voice.
Right.
Her voice that is so strong and powerful.
Yeah.
And a cracking good story.
Yes.
Even though I know exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
I certainly didn't feel that about Wuthering Heights, which I find a very complex and difficult book.
Right.
It's not like Jane Eyre, which I suppose I read when I was 11.
Right.
And Wuthering Heights when I was 17.
Right.
So, right, I think that's all I wanted to ask you. If there's anything you want to ask me.
Well, thank you very much for these questions about my novel. It reminds me of when I set the mastermind questions on Marcel Proust about 20 years ago. I was told to ask first question, when was he born? And the rest was up to me.
1870 something.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And then, well, yes, that's right, not bad, not bad. In fact, you know, by my age, he was dead for 20 years already, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a rather humbling thought, that.
I'm just reading about the Dreyfus affair.
Oh, yes.
Which he cared an awful lot.
He did, there's a lot about it.
What a frightful thing that happened.
Right, I think we should start a Proust reading group.
Oh, there we are. And let's get through the 6 months.
Yes.
That'll carry us through, wouldn't it?
Lockdown.
That's all I really wanted to ask you about your book.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. It was really illuminating, wasn't it, Paddy? Absolutely fascinating.
Great.
And
I think we should ask if anybody would like to add anything to that, or any comments or questions. Maybe while you're getting everybody back up going, Paddy, there's one thing I wanted to ask you. Was the beginning of the book, the first sentence or two is really, really critical.
Yeah.
But then so is the end.
Yes.
And I just wondered whether you knew how the end was going to shape up before, at an early stage of the book, or whether it just evolved. Because
I suppose I have to be totally honest.
Both books had a lot of information in the last few pages. If you're really, really trying to tie up all the loose ends.
Yes.
And whether you sort of thought of that at the beginning, or whether that just comes as you progress.
I think it occurred in the second draft. The second draft, I knew what I was aiming for. The first draft was a total failure because I had no idea what I was aiming for. But then I suddenly, I know how to end this now. And then I sat down and rewrote the whole book.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had the facts.
Yes.
And the great joy of research for me was researching this boy, who in all the Bronte biographies is mentioned in a sentence or two.
Yes.
Right.
And I thought, I held him in my mind for really years, actually, thinking, who was that boy who witnessed Mr. Nicholls' traumatic love of the vicar's daughter? I wonder who that boy was. And it was later, after I wrote the book, because I was always still interested, I found out that Patrick Bronte, Charlotte's father, gave John his son's violin.
Yeah.
And Branwell Bronte was Patrick Bronte's absolute dear, beloved, tragic son. And for him to have given this boy Branwell's violin meant that he was somebody in their lives. Yeah. And it's never, ever been exposed before. And I found the place where he lived. I trespassed to get there. I trespassed through farm property to find the ruin of the house where he lived. And I consulted loads of census records and found out all about his sisters. And when one of them stopped being a worker in a mill, that meant she became a teacher. I thought, why? That's when the imagination says, if the census that year says that, and the census 10 years later says that, what happened in between? The great joy of research is getting some answers. So I had to end my book with the facts, and I found out that John did return to find the place completely different. And nice. When I've been to Haworth and to Stanbury, which is the place where it took place, I was always horrified to find this great big reservoir. In the place where he must have played as a child.
But Charlotte was never going to marry Mr. Nicholls, and then suddenly she was at the altar.
Yeah. Yes, that's slightly strange, actually.
I sort of.
It does happen very quickly.
It did happen, but it did happen quite quickly. And I think it's because she was rather in love with her publisher, and she found out that he was engaged.
And she had
I didn't bother to put that in because it became too complicated.
Case of a rebound, was it really?
It was a little bit of a rebound, and I was very interested that on her wedding night she wrote to, I think it was Ellen, one of her friends, saying, "What a strange thing it is to be married." There's no sense of romance like that.
No,
it was
like a business-like decision.
And then she very gradually really got to love him.
Yeah.
So I had nothing but facts that I had to turn into.
That was a great way to end.
Can we have some more questions?
Paddy,
from
do we have any?
Clive,
yes, I can see.
Clive Dito would like to ask a question.
Robert, when I first met you, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, when I first met you, I knew I'd met you somewhere before. It wasn't at Trinity, it was in my favourite art historian, John Berger. You are Charlbury's John Berger.
Oh, right.
Was he a big influence on you?
I very much admire his writing on art, actually. It wasn't really a conscious influence. I tried to get away from art criticism, actually, and do it originally in my own way. But, you know, amongst, if there's a sort of pecking order of art historians, I think he comes very high, actually.
Is that right?
Glenna?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, both of you. It was fascinating. I love the idea of the connection between novels and art. And I wonder, the girl with the pearl earring, was that the beginning to a certain extent? I mean, I'm not comparing you with that, but was that the beginning of this genre? Because I can't really think of any before that. And then after that, there have been several books that have been connected with art, like The Lady and the Unicorn, and quite a lot of others.
In fact, I'm doing the very same thing at the moment, taking a painting as the central premise for my book. But I don't know if there was anything that before the great popularity of The Girl with the Pearl.
Yeah. I got the feeling it sort of started everything off in a way.
The Girl with the Pearl earring.
I don't know. It's more your period.
No, I can't. Can you remember, Glenna, when that book was published?
No, I can't remember when it was published. Tracy Chevalier, obviously the Vermeer. I've seen it. It's a fantastic painting. No, I can't remember. I'm sorry. I've got a very bad memory.
I'm afraid it gives...
I think her Lady and the Unicorn came after it.
Yes.
Yeah.
The one about the Cluny tapestries.
Yes.
That was off.
And if you've read your Alain Recherche, Marcel, who's a narrator of Alain Recherche, was in love with a painting by Vermeer, A View from Delft. And there's one particular yellow patch of wall he's absolutely obsessed by. There's a description about 6 pages long of his Vermeer painting.
Sorry, Robert, I didn't really hear that. Could you say it again a bit louder, please?
Yes, terribly sorry.
It's okay.
We mentioned Proust. There's an awful lot about art in Proust, actually. There's an awful lot about most things in Proust. But Marcel, who's a narrator of Alain Recherche, is particularly taken by a particular painting by Vermeer called A View of Delft. And
I love that.
On and on about a particular corner of the painting, which is just a yellow patch of wall. He's absolutely obsessed by it.
Oh, fascinating.
It's cross-generic in the same kind of way. I mean, I love writing which crosses between different art forms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did Rachel want to ask a question?
Yes. Juliet's partly answered my question, and that is, what are you two doing next? Do you both have a book in the offing? Are you working on something else, or are you having a rest for a while?
Rest? No, I'm publishing another book, which is completely different. It couldn't be much more different. And in fact, it's set in the Gulf.
Oh, that is different. Is there? I can't imagine any poetry in the Gulf.
Oh, I think there's quite a lot of good Arabic poetry.
Okay. Oh, Arabic. Okay. And Juliet?
I do like to chop and change and do something. And now for something completely different.
Okay.
I don't like repeating myself very much. Do you?
No, I don't think I do actually. I'm concentrating on a book that I'm now doing as an art historian rather than as a novelist, because I've tried it 5 times as a novelist and it doesn't work. And so I'm looking at it in a different way, and it's about a painting by Gauguin of his most unusual and hardly known lover, who appears in a
one lover? Gauguin?
Thank you. I love Gauguin.
Thank you.
I'm just trying to put up Vermeer's View of Delft.
Yes.
On this postcard.
Right.
But I'm going to bring it into the kitchen.
Right.
To give it to you, Robert.
Thank you very much. Have you got a reproduction of it there?
I haven't had it postcard. I'm sure I can see the yellow that you mean.
Yes.
So I'm just going to hand it over to you. Oh, I've got that on my fridge.
There we are.
So that you can.
That's a view from Delft.
There's a little patch of the camera.
There we are. As described by Proust in La Recherche. There's the patch of yellow wall.
Let me see the patch of yellow wall. Any other questions?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Patch of yellow wall.
Yeah.
Well, it's light. We didn't discuss light. I wanted to talk about light in the book, which comes through so often.
It is the quality of the light.
Yes, but it talks about light not just in paintings, but light keeps coming in all over the place.
Yes.
I particularly liked the when the child was being born, she was coming towards the light.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Yes. Paddy, you see any more questions?
Any more questions?
Well, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. And we've got a couple of potential bits of holiday reading. I know I've read them both, but I think
yes.
that they're both books to recommend.
Thank you very much, Juliet.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for Paddy behind the
camera.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
And please thank you to my publishers, Kirsty and Shannon, who I hope are watching. I'm not sure if they are. Even if they're not, thank you very much.
Great. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.